Okay, this is our video for Tuesday, April 17th. We're picking up today with Ford. I think 6 Hour had to end up stopping at genocide in Cambodia because of our calling out of class. We'll pick up from there. So just real quick for genocide in Cambodia. This brutal dictatorship takes over in Cambodia in 75. It's a communist government called the Khmer Rouge, but it's led by this really bad dude named Pol Pot, who leads the genocide of over 1 million of his own people. We stay uninvolved because we don't want to get bogged down in another event like this and get involved in like a similar event to Vietnam, but there was a U.S. merchant ship that was captured by the Khmer Rouge called the Mayaguez. And so the Mayaguez had 38 American hostages on board that were captured by Khmer Rouge. And so Ford does authorize Marines to go in and get these guys out, which we will be successful in doing so. So we will send in Marines to go get out these hostages. Unfortunately, we do have the guys come out, the 39 hostages, but we lose 38 Marines in the process. So another event, foreign affairs, that doesn't go so great for America. So in Southeast Asia, the results of all the events that have been taking place here, some countries fell to communists, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, but others did not. Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, they did not fall to communism like some thought they might. And this is where some people think Vietnam might have been effective. We'll never really know what the outcome was, but some people theorize that had we not fought in Vietnam and kind of stopped communism from easily spreading from Vietnam to Laos and Cambodia, it might have spread a lot farther. That basically because we fought the war there and contained communism there as long as we could, it gave a chance for those other countries like in Thailand and Malaysia and so on to have a chance to kind of develop themselves in the post-World War II decolonization period. So some people think that Vietnam's efforts that we had were effective to some degree. Okay, the next is the economy. You still have stagflation problems. You still have all the post-OPEC problems that plagued Nixon. All that doesn't go away. The only thing that Ford proposes to beat inflation is called WIN, which is Whip Inflation Now. So Whip Inflation Now was this voluntary program that Ford suggested, but because it was voluntary and offered no incentives, no one did it essentially. So the economy sank deeper into the recession as a result, and unemployment got as high as 9% by the time Ford leaves office. He does agree to pass a Democratic package to stimulate the economy, but vetoed over 30 other bills Democrats proposed out of Congress. So not a whole lot of action on the economy. So we've seen now Nixon and Ford both cannot fix the economy. And then finally, one bright spot in Ford's administration was the bicentennial celebration. That after all these years of anti-Vietnam protests and all the radical African-American protests, the Watergate scandal, the Pentagon Papers, the bicentennial celebration in '76 really does try to bring the country kind of back together, that we finally have something to kind of celebrate America with. It's our 200th anniversary. And so we do kind of come back together as a country a little bit under the bicentennial, celebrating America and history and culture and so forth here. And so it does kind of help restore some of our confidence in government in the U.S. as a result. And Ford himself was able to restore a lot of candor and humility into the White House as well after Nixon. One thing I don't have listed on the screen, but I would definitely put down, is something called the Helsinki Accords. Helsinki is spelled Helsinki. It's a city in Scandinavia. It's one of the Scandinavian countries. Anyway, this kind of goes with détente. So if you ever see the Helsinki Accords, it kind of goes along the same lines as SALT I. This is a treaty signed between the United States and the Soviets, along with several other countries, where basically we pledge to stop using war as a means of fighting each other. We also plan to stop using, to respect each other's borders. Like, we're not going to invade other territories. We're going to respect borders. And so this was a very positive, continuation of détente under Ford, where our two countries pledged to respect other territories and to work together economically, those kind of things. But then finally you have the election in 1976. So Ford does decide to run, but he was not the clear frontrunner. In fact, Ronald Reagan almost beat him in the nomination process because Ford was a fill-in for Nixon and was never the clear candidate to win in '76. So Reagan actually does run against them, but doesn't win, but it's a foreshadowing that he's going to win in 1980. You even see that one state, Washington, gives a couple of their electoral votes to Reagan in 1970, 76, excuse me. Jimmy Carter was picked by the Democrats. Jimmy Carter was the governor of Georgia, and he had success winning this election as an outsider. People were kind of tired of this Washington establishment after all the problems under Johnson and Nixon, and they felt like a lot of corruption in Washington needed to be changed, and so they wanted to bring in this governor, this outsider, and so they elected Jimmy Carter. He carried most of the South in this election and got 97% of the African American vote, and Democrats were also able to control Congress under Jimmy Carter. Even though the South does vote Democratic in this election, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that you had Nixon out the election. You also had Nixon become unpopular with all the things that he did. But you see the popular vote was very close. It was basically 50 to 48%. It was not that dramatically different, even though Carter wins a huge chunk of the South and part of the East Coast and so forth. But anyway, Jimmy Carter becomes the next president, and he is a one-term president. He had a more informal style that seemed to signal the end of the imperial presidency. But he had difficulty with veteran members of Congress since he was an outsider, and his advisors didn't help either. So he wasn't great in knowing how to get Congress to work for him, like you saw with some previous administrations. So his presidency wasn't that impactful either, and some consider it to be not successful or a failure even because of some of the things he did or did not do. So let's first look at the foreign policy. Carter was very big into human rights. He was called the great humanitarian. He preached, like Wilson, on world issues. So he really wanted to address a lot of world issues in general, and he wanted to have America send aid or help to countries that might need humanitarian aid in general. So some notable things he does for human rights diplomacy is that he does appoint Andrew Young as the first African-American ambassador to the United Nations. So that's an important signal that we have an African-American male serve as our ambassador to the United Nations. We also denounced the oppression of the black majority in South Africa during apartheid in Zimbabwe. Carter also cut off aid to Argentina and Chile due to their oppressive dictators. So he does try to do more things in the same spirit of humanitarian aid and humanitarian rights. And, you know, that's one thing about Jimmy Carter that's good. Even though he wasn't successful as president that much, in his life after the presidency, he does a lot of humanitarian aid and causes, which actually leads him to win the Nobel Peace Prize years after he's president. Then you have the Panama Canal. So something that makes Teddy Roosevelt turn in his grave is that he wanted to correct the past wrongs of America. In 1978, he had the Senate agree to a treaty that would slowly give Panama control back over their canal zone, which was completed as of January 1st of 2000. So Jimmy Carter made the policy to give up the Panama Canal, which started in 1978, but will not be completed until January 1st of 2000, excuse me. And this is one of the things they used against him in 1980 whenever he ran for re-election, the Republicans. Then you have the Camp David Accords. The Camp David Accords is often regarded as Jimmy Carter's highest achievement in foreign policy or in his administration. So for several decades, Israel and Arab countries around it have been fighting one another. And I'm going to go off kind of tangent here for a second because I don't think I've talked about Israel yet in this class. But Israel was formed as a country back in 1948 after World War II, mostly because of the Holocaust, and people felt sorry for them. And so Israel, the people who were Jewish or people who were Israel had not had a country officially since the Roman times, 2,000 years ago, when they were kicked out around the 2nd century A.D. So in the meantime, since that period, you had other people live in what is now Israel. They became Muslim Palestinians. So Palestinians had lived in that area, but Palestinians never really officially had a country. At one point, they were controlled by the Byzantine Empire, then the Ottoman Empire, and then most recently they were controlled by Europeans as colonies. So the Palestinians who lived in Israel never really had their own country either. So after World War II, you have Palestinians already living in what is going to become Israel, and Jewish people who are now being offered this deal by the United Nations to create a country in what is now Israel. So that's the deal that struck. In 1948, the United Nations will help develop a new country in the Middle East called Israel for Jews to go to and create as their new homeland, as kind of a make good from the Holocaust. But this makes a lot of Muslim countries upset because they feel, well, Muslim countries around Israel feel like it should be owned and run by Muslims, by Palestinians. And so in 1948, Palestinians and Israelis kind of share the territory, but almost immediately begin to fight each other. So from 1940s until the 1960s, Israelis and Palestinians fight each other, and sometimes Arab countries around them, which are Muslim, help them out. By the late 60s, Israel is mostly controlled by Jewish folks, and essentially there is very little territory that Palestinians still control. And so there's these various conflicts between Arab countries and Israel. Every time there's a conflict, America sends aid to Israel to help fight, because we become an ally from the day they're created, which is one of the reasons why we had the OPEC crisis in 73, because we sent aid to them and help Israel out, and then you have this issue where OPEC cuts us off, right? Well, the Camp David Accords, coming back to the bullet point here, is between Egypt and Israel. Egypt had fought Israel back in the 1960s and 70s, and their new leader, Anwar Sadat, which you don't have to know, decided enough was enough, and they wanted to go ahead and make a peace deal with Israel. So they wanted to approach the leader of Israel, the Prime Minister, Menachem Begin. And so Carter invited both of these guys to come out to Camp David. Camp David is a presidential retreat center in Maryland, and he invites Anwar Sadat, he invites Jimmy Carter to both come out to this retreat center to work out a deal. And so in 1978, Egypt and Israel make the first Israel-Arab country peace treaty, which is a big signal for acceptance, because none of the Arab countries accepted Israel as legitimate. They all thought it should be Palestine. And so that's a big deal for, number one, they recognize it, but number two, they made peace. So it's the first Muslim country to make peace with Israel and also recognize it. And it also kind of signals the coming maybe peace in the Middle East one day. But it was opposed by a lot of other Arab countries. In fact, there's a very famous group that operates in Palestine called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, called the PLO. And they operate kind of as a terrorist group back in this time period, in the 70s, 80s, and 60s. And they oppose this deal, and they, to this day, the PLO is still trying to fight for a country here where Israel is. All right, so anyway, the next event is actually the event that hurts Jimmy Carter the most, which is going to be the Iranian hostage crisis. So this goes back to what we talked about in Unit 11 for y'all, which was whenever Eisenhower installed this leader into Iran back in 53, Reza Pahlavi, who became the Shah of Iran. So we put Reza Pahlavi in charge of Iran back in 53, overthrowing a democratically elected government because we wanted this guy in charge because he would be pro-America, pro-Western oil, and so forth. And so we supported the Shah of Iran from the 1950s until the 1970s. He was always one of our biggest allies in the Middle East. They had embraced a lot of Western culture, but he was very cruel to their people. He had a secret police. He had people jailed, arrested, killed. So he wasn't great to his people, but all we cared about was the fact that he was pro-U.S., pro-West, and traded us oil. Well, there's this rising Muslim or Islamic fundamentalism movement that's happening in the Middle East kind of in general. And so what happens in 1978, 79 is that there's beginning to be revolts inside of Iran. And it's becoming apparent that Jimmy Carter, that the Shah cannot control them. So the Shah, the leader of Iran, decides to leave the country and become, basically go into exile. And when that happens, you're going to see this Islamic priest take over, the Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah is his title, so Ayatollah Khomeini is going to take over. Here's the picture of Ayatollah Khomeini who takes over. But he takes over the government in Iran, creating this very Islamic fundamentalist government. So you go from having a very pro-West government to now having a mostly Middle Eastern, style government that's very much against Western influence. In the meantime, the Shah, while he's on the run, gets cancer. And so Jimmy Carter, against his Jimmy Carter lets him come here because his advisors told him to. Jimmy Carter thought it might be a bad idea, but Jimmy Carter lets the Shah come here anyway to get cancer treatment. So the Shah of Iran, the guy who was ousted, comes to the United States in 1979 to seek medical treatment. And the Iranians find out about this, so they demand we give him over. They demand that the Shah come back to Iran and they also demand that America stops intervening in Middle Eastern affairs. So, of course, we don't do that. And whenever that happens, a lot of angry young protesters, a lot of college-age kids in Iran get so upset they storm the embassy in Iran, or Tehran, the capital. They storm the embassy and take over 60 people hostage. So 60 Americans who worked in the embassy in Tehran were taken hostage by a lot of radicals there in Iran. The majority of those guys are going to be held for over 440 days in Iran. So Jimmy Carter is going to work for the next 5 months. This starts in November of 79. So this lasts from November of 79 until January of 1981. Jimmy Carter is going to try and negotiate unsuccessfully for their release for the next about 4 or 5 months, and they won't turn them over as long as we have the Shah. Then by April of 1980, Jimmy Carter tries to launch this secret mission called Operation Eagle Claw to get these guys out of there. The whole mission's a disaster when there's like weather issues, as well as when the plane crashes. So the whole military intervention here essentially fails as well too. So in the meantime, Jimmy Carter looks very inept as a leader. He can't get Americans out of here. He can't help liberate these guys out of Iran. And the military operation to get them out also failed too, which is one of the things that Reagan will use against him in the 1980 election. So basically, America can't do anything about this, and they'll be trapped there until later on until the next year. Later in 1980, the Shah will die from cancer. At that point, the hostages can be released, but to spite Jimmy Carter, the Iranians do not release the hostages until the day Reagan gets inaugurated, because they didn't like Jimmy Carter so much to be spiteful. They didn't release him until the 50 hostages until Jimmy Carter left office, the same day that Ronald Reagan became president. All right, the last little bit here about foreign policies on the Cold War. At first, Carter continues détente. So just like Nixon and Ford had done, Ford continues détente. And in fact, we officially recognized the Communist government of China in 1979 after Nixon had laid the groundwork for that. And Carter began to develop a SALT II treaty to it continued to limit the types of nuclear weapons that we have. In 1979, Carter begins this SALT II process, making another wave of arms reduction. But it never comes to pass, because in December of 79, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. So December of 79, Soviets invade Afghanistan, and that event's important because that will end détente. So in December of 79, whenever the Soviets invade Afghanistan, they're going to end this is going to end détente. SALT II never passes because of this, and détente comes to conclusion. So going into the 80s now, you're going to have a much more contentious relationship between our two countries again. So détente is now over with. Why did they go into Afghanistan? Well, because basically there was revolutions going on in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was on the Soviet border. They didn't want this very unstable country in their border, so they invaded to kind of regain influence and control over Afghanistan. But Afghanistan kind of becomes the Vietnam for the Soviets. They're going to fight there for about 10 years, and nothing really gets accomplished there. And we also help give a lot of weapons and supplies to the Afghanistan side throughout that 10-year period. So it's kind of payback for Vietnam for us too. Anyway, the United States feared that this might lead to the Soviets wanting more control of that territory, of that area, and maybe lead to the Soviets trying to control the Persian Gulf area. So Carter's reaction to this was to put an embargo on Soviet grain, and we stopped selling them high-tech technology to the Soviets as well, too, to hurt them. We also famously boycotted the 1980 Olympics. So in 1980, the Summer Olympics were being held in Moscow, and so we boycotted their Olympics. But in return, in 1984, whenever the Summer Olympics were held in Los Angeles, they boycotted ours. So we boycotted each other's Olympics over this whole invasion of Afghanistan, or our anti-Soviet policies now. And so now going into the 80s, we kind of go back to this arms buildup after, the whole détente phase ends with the invasion of Afghanistan. This is also right when you have the Miracle on Ice, the famous sporting event wherever Americans beat the Russian hockey team, because back in those years, the Winter Olympics were the same as the Summer Olympics. So also in 1980, the Winter Olympics were not in Moscow, and we go and compete there against the Soviets. We actually beat them just a few weeks after they had invaded Afghanistan. We're able to beat them in this
Olympic hockey game, which was very incredible for the time because the Soviet team was always this powerhouse. One was like number one, all these great professionals, and this ragtag team of Americans were able to beat them in that hockey event in 1980 as a result. So the détente period is now over with. We'll briefly look at domestic policy under Carter as well too. The biggest issue domestic-wise was the economy and growing inflation. Carter tried to conserve oil energy and revive the U.S. coal industry, but that effort failed. Congress failed to produce anything to reduce oil usage and check inflation, and so inflation got as high as 13% by 1980. So inflation was extremely high, and it continued to hurt the Carter administration as a direct result. So inflation slowed growth and prevented consumers from affording high interest rates. The Fed, the Federal Reserve, tried to break inflation by pushing interest rates higher to about 20% by 1980. This actually hurts the automobile industry and building industries as a result, because if you have higher interest rates, it's harder to take out a loan to build homes or to buy cars. And so a lot of those industries, real estate industries, manufacturing industries, for car industries, got hurt, had to lay a bunch of people off because of higher interest rates. Thousands of people lost their job. So the inflation, the middle class people also to a higher tax bracket, which means these middle class folks are also paying higher taxes, which also hurts their spending abilities in the late 70s as well. Social programs also increased in this time period, which helped increase the national debt. And so in general, by the late 70s, American standard of living was on the decline. So just like for Nixon, Carter essentially has no answer to the stagflation, the high inflation problems, and the oil crises and so forth. Let me see something about oil crisis real quick. Also on a side note, in 1979, this goes with the inflation stuff, there's a second oil crisis in 79. This one tied into the Iranian hostage crisis, because thousands of those workers who were in the oil industry in Iran went on strike, or not strike, went to protest all the stuff that was happening in Iran. There was a second oil shortage in 1979, which again hurts the pumps back home in America. So that's one of the other reasons why Jimmy Carter pushes coal and not using oil in America. This is so why more Americans are buying cars that are more fuel efficient and non-American cars. That hurts the automobile industry, because fewer people are buying cars now because they can afford American gas guzzling cars, which means that American car factory workers are getting laid off. So the last thing for Carter is that Carter will run for his re-election, but he lost a lot of popularity. All of his intelligence, effort, and integrity were not enough to keep Carter in power. He was hurt greatly by the Iranian hostage crisis, by inflation continuing to get worse and worse, and economic crisis getting worse and worse. He famously delivered what's referred to as the National Malay Speech in 1979, where he said there was a moral and spiritual crisis in the country, which that's not really cool. Basically, Carter said the reason why America's doing so poorly is that Americans don't have, the can-do work attitude, and don't have happy attitude in general. So many blamed him for his weak and indecisive leadership, and he leaves office with one of the lowest approval ratings at 23%. We're going to stop there, and tomorrow pick up with the last slide, the cultural things of the 1970s, and we'll in Unit 12 there. So